Just starting to record. I'm just going to say a couple of things and then hand it over to Ryan. He's put together some very interesting stuff to talk about. So welcome again, everyone. I'm very glad to see my grid filling up almost as much as it was last time. With things like this, you never know when people is going to bail, but I'm very happy to see so many people interested in a relatively abstract topic. So I'm just going to dive in to this discussion, and based on some stuff that I was talking to Kale about last week, I thought it would be good to really make sure that we're clear on what every graph that we might look at is. Some of you, I guess the physics background people would have seen this quote before, but I really like it. And it's this idea that principal object of theoretical research, or one of them, is to find the point of view from which the subject appears in the greatest simplicity. And for those of you who don't know, Willard Gibbs is the person who, he's one of the greatest American physicists of all time. But one thing that I'm very grateful to him for was that the del notation that makes the Maxwell's equations much simpler. If the way that Maxwell himself wrote them was kind of nightmarish. And that's an example, even at the level of notation, where just looking at something from a different perspective and condensing it can make understanding it much easier. And I was thinking about that in the context of all the different graphs that one will be looking at in this book. So up on the top left, we have what we were calling the state space, where we have the in the 1D we have the derivative and the position. But you have to always keep in mind what's on the x-axis and y-axis. And in one of our professors used to not like using the term x-axis. He used to always say use abscissa and ordinate instead of x and y, because this x variable is going to move around and be on various axes. So just look, and if you're not clear on what's being represented, just ask for any plot that you see. And so on the top right, you see a solution or a trajectory. That's not the state space, but that's something that once you've analyzed the system, that might be one of the possible trajectories you get. On the bottom left, you see the potential landscape. So in 1D, you can always compute a potential, and the system will tend downwards with respect to potential, or which you can always think of as a cost function. And what we're going to talk about today, we'll be looking at bifurcation diagrams. So in the book, Strogatz will often just say use X when he's talking about actually the position of the fixed point. So it's a small point, but if you're being very careful, you would not mark it as X exactly, but X. I just put X sub F just to make clear that we're not plotting the full space. We're plotting specifically the fixed points, if there are any, with respect to some parameter. So once we reach the concept of parameters, I think another term for it is codimension. Once we're in that zone, we're talking not just about one dynamical system, but a whole family of dynamical systems, and which you may be able to gradually transform through. So, okay, with that, I'm going to let Ryan take over, and he will launch us into bifurcations. Go for it.
Thanks, Johan. And yeah, I realized at some point in preparing my slides that it's going to be a lot easier if I label all my axes. So I went back and labeled all of my axes and was careful about, for me, the fixed points will be X star or something like that. Anyway, you'll see. So please interrupt with questions if you have any, no matter how basic or trivial or non sequitur they may seem. Right. So the way I want to motivate this, I want to say that if we're formulating a model in the physicist sense, we want to have a dynamical system. Maybe we have some state variable X, and we want to express the time derivative of that state variable in terms of X. For such a model to be reasonable, before we think about whether it's behaving in a way that aligns with our expectations, before we think about whether there can be any ground truth that explains that model, we have to avoid fine-tuning. Fine-tuning means that whatever parameters we put in this model, they're not going to be God-given. Like if your model has a specific behavior when your parameter is square root of 2, or which differs from if it's off by square root of 2 by like 1 part in 10 million, then it's not a reasonable physical model. So for example, here is a finely tuned model. So one where dx dt is x squared. So does anyone want to say what the qualitative behavior of this model is?
Parabola.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a parabola. That's right. But what I mean is like here's what happens. So let's imagine that our particle moves along the x-axis, right? And here I've plotted x squared, which is dx dt. So if it's to the left of this 0, the velocity is positive, so it's moving to the right. And then it's slowing down as the velocity is getting closer to 0. And then at 0, it's a fixed point, right? On the other hand, if we start over here to this side, it's unstable. The velocity is positive and it just grows. So it quickly runs away from this point. So what I would say is the qualitative behavior of the system is that we have a fixed point that's attractive from the left side and repels points on the right. This behavior is fine-tuned because if we think about adding any small amount, any small constant to the right-hand side of this equation, the behavior totally changes. For instance, if I add some positive epsilon, here epsilon can be anything greater than 0, then we no longer have any fixed point. If we start the system anywhere along x, the velocity is always positive. All of these points move to the right. So there's no, all of the points end up at plus infinity. Meanwhile, if I had the opposite sign for epsilon, or take minus epsilon with epsilon greater than 0, then I still have a fixed point, but actually I have 2 fixed points now. I have one fixed point, which you can reason that since the velocity is positive on the left of the fixed point and negative on the right of the fixed point, this is a stable fixed point. It has a attractive basin of all of the points to the left of it and all of the points in between these 2 zeros of the parabola where the velocity is negative. And this is also a fixed point, but it's an unstable fixed point. If we're on this side of the parabola, the points are flowing to infinity. If they're on the other side of the parabola, they're flowing to the other fixed point. So these 2 behaviors for plus epsilon and minus epsilon are completely different from each other. So if you wanted to say that this was the model, you would have to have some deeper reason why you can't add something like a small epsilon. So this is tempting to just say we throw out all finely tuned models, but actually there's something important to realize here, which is not only is the behavior of the finely tuned model unstable, but the behaviors for either sign of the perturbation are completely different from each other. So if we think about this as a family of models now, where P is like a parameter, then what we're saying is that we have for P less than 0, we have no fixed point. For P equals 0, we have our finely tuned model. And for P greater than 0, we have 2 fixed points. So we can think about the finely tuned model as a sort of phase transition. We can draw what I'll call a phase diagram, which just plots as a function of parameter what the qualitative behavior is at every parameter value. So for P less than 0, like I said, there's no fixed point. For P greater than 0, there's one stable fixed point and one unstable fixed point. And at this point in the middle is what we call a bifurcation. So this is called a saddle node bifurcation. And one reason for this term is that, well, maybe you can justify this term in various ways, but I think about it as the flows are diverging as we vary the parameter. So if we're in the P less than 0 regime, then all of the initial conditions are flowing to positive infinity. Whereas if we're here in the P greater than 0 regime, all of the initial conditions, whether they flow to plus infinity or whether they flow to this new fixed point depends on where they are. So there's a bifurcation. You either have one behavior or the other. So you could say that at the unstable fixed point, this is kind of the dividing line between the two attractive basins. That's kind of where the bifurcation is happening. If you made P very small, you would see that this point is kind of shooting off the unstable fixed point. And so it's spreading into these two fixed points. So this is, roughly speaking, what a bifurcation is. Let's talk about, well, are there any questions?
Do you have any examples for these three that are more concrete?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you an example right now for a slightly different bifurcation, but of course you can find mechanical examples in the book, although they're sort of contrived. The reason I don't want to give a physical example for this one is because here x is running away to a fixed point at plus infinity, so it's not very reasonable behavior if x is supposed to be some state variable, right? The system is sort of blowing up. Usually you have some other fixed points at very like large x that it'll flow to. But you'll see all of this in like a simulation soon. Okay, so right, one more thing that I wanted to mention about this is that you can draw the fixed points and sort of give a slightly more detailed story of what's going on than just this phase diagram by drawing what's called the bifurcation diagram, where here what we're going to do is we're going to plot the fixed points x star as a function of the parameter p. So around here is p equals 0. For p less than 0, there are no fixed points, and I haven't plotted anything. For p greater than 0, there are two fixed points, one stable, one unstable. I plotted the stable one as a solid line and the unstable one as this dashed line. And here at the bifurcation at the bifurcation point, the stable and unstable fixed points are merging and disappearing. Or if you think about it as going the other way, we're creating a pair, a stable, unstable pair of fixed points. So this bifurcation diagram is going to be a very important means of thinking about these bifurcations and even classifying them. So here's a nice model. I was going to talk about the laser. There's the laser example is in the Strogatz book, but I find the physics of it a little bit baffling. I mean, maybe you can take it at face value, but here is a model that maybe I find more reasonable because it's not in my field, which is a model of population dynamics of a single species. So imagine that P represents the population of some species that has some growth rate R. So R takes into account both the births and the deaths. If we just had R, so forget this second order term for a second. If we just had dp dt equals rp, then we would have either exponential growth for positive R or exponential decay for negative R. Now, the point of the second term is that if we have exponential growth, we imagine that, well, exponential growth can't go on forever. It has to stop somewhere. And the simplest term order by order in P that you can write down that'll eventually stop the exponential growth is this quadratic term in P squared. That so K is some positive number that will just be fixed. So let's quickly analyze this system. So there's a fixed point at P equals 0. That's easy to see. On the right-hand side is just 0 when P is 0. And if we want to analyze the stability of the fixed point, well, I'm not going to, there's a general technique, but intuitively, what you would do is you would think about initial conditions that start very close to P. So we basically want to understand the behavior of trajectories that are where P is very small. So where P is, say, epsilon times little p, and then we're going to think about epsilon as infinitesimal, so we can discard quadratic and higher order terms in epsilon. And basically all that does is discard the quadratic piece. So we find from this analysis that the fixed point is stable if we have r less than 0. So that just means that we have some deaths outnumber births. So indeed, the population goes to 0. Any amount of, it's a stable equilibrium, any positive population eventually dies out. But if r is greater than 0, it's unstable. And like I said, the quadratic term will catch it. Well, we can see that this happens by drawing the plots. So if we plot dp dt as a function of p, for r less than 0, it looks like this. dp dt is just always negative. And indeed, this is the 0 is the only fixed point, and it's stable. Whereas for r greater than 0, now the fixed point at 0 is unstable, and there's a new fixed point, which is now stable. And you can think about that in population terms. That's the carrying capacity. And if you were to just suspend your interpretation and draw the negative p part of this graph, you would see that what happened was that this was a parabola that had another fixed point at negative p, and which was stable or unstable, which merged with the fixed point at 0, and then came out on the other side as a stable fixed point. So in the bifurcation diagram, now I've drawn the parameter here that we're tuning as r, and the fixed points are p star. Still, I'm going to draw the stable fixed points as dark lines and the unstable ones as dashed lines. So for negative r down here, here's p equals 0. So we only have one non-negative fixed point, and it's stable. And then at the bifurcation point, r equals 0, suddenly we have a positive population stable fixed point. And now the fixed point at p equals 0 is still there, but it's unstable. And what you can think is that this is a stable fixed point and an unstable fixed point which collide, and the stable fixed point now comes out at the angle that the unstable fixed point was coming in. It looks kind of like a scattering diagram, but the species change. So this is called the transcritical bifurcation. And to make this a little bit more concrete, let's see. Yeah. Well, are there any questions about this model? I don't want to go too fast, so if you...
Why did you draw the bifurcation diagram the other way from the first?
No reason, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I guess it's like, yeah, whether you want to think about your parameter as this way or the other way, whichever way you want to look at it. Yeah, no real reason to do it one way or the other.
Yeah, I assume so. I just wanted to be clear on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me show you a simulation that I made that I think, can you see my browser here with this like curve?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So let's reload this. Okay, so what I'm plotting here is, this is a system whose equation I should have written on the page, but you can see what it looks like here. It's in white, I've graphed dx dt, And I've drawn the x-axis here in blue for convenience, which really is the x-axis in this case. And these dots are just initial conditions that I keep spawning at various locations, at various initial x's, and I let them evolve by dxdt equals this curve. So right now, this curve is minus x cubed. Maybe you can recognize it. And I've added 2 parameters to the game. This a parameter is the constant. So this is minus x cubed plus a. And this is minus x cubed plus a plus bx. So b is the linear term, a is the constant term. And what we have here basically is the phase diagram. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So first of all, what I want you to notice is that we're at a bifurcation. You can see that if I tune B, right now, the behavior is we have a single fixed point, and it appears to be stable. You can see that it's stable because all of the points are flowing into the fixed point. But if I tune B, for negative B, it's still a single stable fixed point. But for positive B, now something interesting has happened where I have 3 fixed points. I can tell that there are 3 fixed points because there are 3 places where the curve crosses the x-axis. And recognizing the dots, I see that this one is attractive. You can see the dots are going into it. This one is repulsive. You can see the dots are leaving it. And this one is attractive again. So by tuning B, I can go from a single fixed point to 3 fixed points. So this is bifurcation. This is, which one is this? This is the pitchfork or cusp bifurcation. And there's a bunch of interesting things to say about it. Maybe the first that you can see here is that these points get to be moving very, very slowly when they approach this fixed point. So there's one stable fixed point here. Also for positive B, there's one stable fixed point. Notice for positive B, they approach the fixed point rather rapidly. If you were to solve the equation here, the solution is roughly that they decay exponentially quickly to the fixed point.
Or negative B, not positive B.
Oh yeah, this is negative B. Thank you. Right, so this is minus x cubed minus something times x. Whereas here, you can see they're very slow. And in fact, so epsilon is this respawn parameter. I'm deleting points that are moving too slowly. If I stop doing that, you can see how slow the points get. They will eventually reach the fixed point, but they'll take a really long time to do it. This is called critical slowing down. It's actually something that's observed at phase transitions, that the dynamics appears to slow down as you approach the critical point, the phase transition. That's what I wanted to say. This thing does some other cool phase transition stuff. So let's say we're in the positive B region. Now, what's happened here? So I have at least one point that's stuck at the unstable fixed point, and I have some points stuck at the 2 stable fixed points. Well, if I just wiggle A a bit, you can see that the point at the unstable fixed point, well, it got kicked off, right? Because I moved the unstable fixed point, and because it was unstable, it went to the other stable fixed point. If I keep tuning A, something else interesting is going to happen. So notice if I just tune A gently, these points sort of, they stick to the stable fixed point that they're already at. But if I start to move it so that this curve, this part of the curve gets close to a tangent, then we recognize the first bifurcation that we saw. And we expect what's going to happen is that this stable fixed point and this unstable fixed point are going to meet and disappear. right? And that's exactly what's going to happen as soon as this curve lifts the x-axis. So here, notice it's very slow still, but it's leaving and it goes to the other fixed point. So that is what's called a catastrophe. If you think about just trying to model the equilibrium dynamics of this system, then as I'm tuning parameters, dramatic stuff is happening, right? Here, away from any bifurcation, the equilibrium is changing smoothly with the parameters. But as soon as I pass the bifurcation, it may take a long time, but the equilibrium, eventually finds its equilibrium, and the equilibrium will have jumped discontinuously in the parameter. So that's called a catastrophe. And also note something fun about this equilibrium point is that, so let's pay attention to A. So here I am at A about 0, and all of the points are on the left fixed point. Okay, so I increase A. We go through this catastrophe. Now there's a unique equilibrium or unique stable fixed point. It's over here. Now we decrease A. And now we're near 0 again, but now we're on the other side. So this is a phenomenon called hysteresis. It occurs all over the place. It's a kind of memory that the system has, right? It remembers what path and parameters we took to get to this point, to know whether the system is in this equilibrium or this equilibrium. And that's something that commonly happens, for instance, in ferromagnetism, that this dynamical system is actually a pretty decent model of. And so the last thing that I want to say about this is that here I've drawn the phase diagram. So we have two parameters in this model, A and B. And so here I've plotted, just remind myself, so A is the horizontal coordinate. Here, this point is plotting the pair AB. So this direction in this phase diagram is A, this direction is B. And what I've drawn in blue here is the set where bifurcations occur. So you can think about this diagram as roughly divided into two regions. The region above this curve, which is called the cusp, or maybe whatever, let's call this curve a cusp. The region above it, there are 3 fixed points, right? You can see these 3 fixed points. The region below it, there's only 1 fixed point, no matter where we are in that region. So you can think about the way this curve is defined is it's the boundary between the region with 1 fixed point and 3 fixed points. If I cross this curve, say over here, anywhere in this part, I'm going to have a saddle node bifurcation. So you can see that happening right here, where 2 fixed points are being born as I cross this curve. So I can cross it here or on the other side, and here 2 fixed points are being annihilated. Notice it's a different pair. So let's get back to a reasonable parameter. Okay, and now this special point here, you can think about what's happening is that, right, so here we have 2 fixed points being born. Here we have a different pair of fixed points being annihilated. If I'm at the cusp, right, so it's kind of hard to find actually I can just put it in. So the cusp at 0, 0, that's where both of these things are happening simultaneously. So there's 2 saddle node bifurcations. One saddle node bifurcation happens here and one happens here, but in some sense they're a different saddle node bifurcation that merge together at this special point, this cusp. So this cusp is its own kind of bifurcation, but you need 2 parameters to find it. So some people say it's a codimension 2 bifurcation, because in your parameter space, if your parameter space is n dimensions, it occupies n minus 2 dimensions. So here n is 2, occupies this is a 0-dimensional point. All right. Okay. So are there questions about this? Of course, you have this to play with, as well as another one I'll share with you, and it's sort of the next codimension singularity.
I guess you can mention this at some point, but it might be nice, considering that a lot of us haven't really used this in a practical context, maybe to give an idea of how someone might look at an experimental phenomenon and guess that there is a catastrophe, or a place where you might want to try a particular dynamical system. Like, well, how might this interface with an experimentalist's way of doing things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't have a good answer for that. Actually, if you look in Strogatz's book, he talks a little bit about catastrophe theory and mentions that there was this guy Zeeman in the 70s who sort of tried to apply catastrophe theory to everything. He used this observation that the equilibrium changes discontinuously was so hyped up. It was like, okay, now we have the explanation for every discontinuous phenomenon that you could possibly imagine. Well, there's some good references in Strogatz's book that I recommend checking out, talking about how theorists were fooled into thinking that it's easy to explain experiments using these kinds of models. So I think the answer is that it's sort of hard, but nonetheless, we do see some familiar behaviors. So some characteristic behaviors of this curve, I would say definitely hysteresis, this fact that we can return to our original parameters and which equilibrium we're in. It depends on how we got there. So that's something that's observed in magnets. For instance, if you apply a magnetic field to a magnet, you could think about it as a whole bunch of little tiny magnets. They will all align with your applied magnetic field. And then when you turn the magnetic field off, they'll still be aligned in the direction that you applied it. So that's a kind of hysteresis effect. Critical slowing down is also important. So this fact that when we're right just about at the bifurcation, the fact that even though the equilibrium sort of jumps, it's actually not an avalanche, right? It's a very, very slow, I don't know what you call it. It's very slow going until it actually gets away from the fixed points that were just destroyed.
Yeah, it's in no hurry to get to the other attractor.
Yeah.
It's like the calm before the storm.
Exactly. And let's see. This
Before I
direction.
forget, maybe we can put a flag here and people can remind me to talk about it later. The magnetization example is interesting for neuroscientists also because of the Hopfield model, which grew out of an analogy with spin glasses and a particular way of thinking about magnetization. So some of that might come up again. That's a much more high dimensional system in one sense. So, but it's just something that maybe keep in mind because a lot of you will have heard of the Hopfield model from memory. So if just remind me if anyone wants to talk about that later.
Okay, very good. All right, so if there are no more questions about the simulation, I'll try to tell you a little bit about the classification of singularities, and then I'll finish. So let's go back here. So I showed you 3 kinds of singularities so far. I showed you the cusp or pitchfork bifurcation that we just simulated. I showed you this transcritical bifurcation, and I showed you this saddle node bifurcation. And now, to address a point in the beginning where I said that this model is finely tuned, so it's not reasonable, but we can add one parameter and suddenly it is reasonable. So what does that mean? In particular, how do we know that we've added enough parameters? Or how do we know that we've included the most important parameters? So in this x squared example, so I told you we can add this constant term, and that can destabilize the unique fixed point at x squared if we just have the x squared term. But let's say we add some other terms. For instance, if we add this linear term, you can see that this linear term, well, it does do something. It just doesn't do very much. In effect, it just moves the fixed points around. And the reason why that is that if you redefine x by a constant, you can see that that's going to shift both the linear term and the constant term. So by moving your origin in x, you can eliminate one of these terms. So we typically just eliminate the linear term because the constant term is simpler. Fine. Well, what about a more complicated term? For instance, an x cubed term. Well, an x cubed term is kind of dangerous because it's eventually, no matter how small the coefficient of x cubed is, it's eventually going to be bigger than all of the other terms. So it's got to do something. It's going to be eventually the dominant term. But as long as the coefficient is small, near the fixed points, which were close to x equals 0, it doesn't do very much. So here I've plotted, for instance, just 1/2 x cubed plus x squared. And you can see there is a new fixed point at x equals 2. But at x equals 0, we have the same behavior that we had before. It's roughly a parabola that's tangent to the x-axis. So if we think about adding a constant term, we're going to get the same bifurcation before, where we have a stable and an unstable fixed point created out of nothing, or perhaps annihilating into nothing. Whereas this extra fixed point kind of just comes along for the ride. So if I draw the bifurcation diagram, here I wrote epsilon, but I was calling it P before, or here it's P2. Our parameter is going to be a constant shift here. And what happens is for maybe minus P here, so that for positive, for this part of the diagram, we have 3 fixed points, sort of cutting this curve here, here, and there. And for smaller values, we have just the 1 fixed point. So in the bifurcation diagram, we can plainly see that this part of the diagram is our familiar saddle node bifurcation. There's just other stuff going on at the same time. And this would actually be a pretty reasonable physical model of something, perhaps. It has the stability, it has the global stability property. X never runs away to infinity. But whether X gets stuck around here or whether it goes all the way to the fixed point that's always there is a matter of whether you're on one side of this bifurcation or not. So this property of a bifurcation, or more precisely of a family with bifurcations in it, is called stability. We want to say that any small perturbation doesn't change the quote unquote topological properties of the bifurcation, which I take to mean the structure of the bifurcation diagram, including all of its labels, who's stable, who's unstable.
In that diagram on the left, on the right, is x star decreasing as it goes up?
All right, so let's see. Yeah, so actually this curve should actually go like this because it's eventually going to merge with the other fixed point that comes out here. So these get capped off in another saddle node bifurcation. So it actually more broadly forms an S. But as long as we're looking near 0 and we have P very small, it looks just like one saddle node bifurcation. So in that sense, the saddle node bifurcation is stable with just a single parameter. Did that answer your question?
No, I was actually asking if the fixed point, so X star, if it is as you go up, it is more negative, and as you go down, it's more positive. Or
Oh, you're just saying if this axis
yeah,
is drawn negative to this one. Yeah, it sure looks like it, right? Because when you create the pair here, the stable one will be on the left, and then you'll have the unstable one, and then you'll have the one that you already have. So that's right. So this is negative.
so
X.
it's preserving the orientation of the other.
Yeah. Just rotate the
Yeah.
diagram.
Yeah.
Yep. See, this is why gotta label your axes. Okay, so this notion of stability is very important. As you can imagine, it's quite hard to prove stability because we have to say that anything we add to x squared plus p doesn't change the topological properties of the bifurcation diagram. Now, you might imagine that at least any x to the n we write down, then we can add a whole bunch of, we can add the missing polynomial terms of lower degree and get a stable bifurcation, and that's true. It's hard to argue. It's hard to argue it in general, and in fact, you can't argue it in general. As you get to bifurcations with more and more parameters, you find that they're not all stable, or they can't even be made stable, which is that there will always be some parameters such that the topological features of the bifurcation diagram can change continuously. So those are,
That
those
would
said they
mean
have
you can have a lot
moduli.
of global minima without actually sitting on any global minima, right? That's what the moduli is.
Say again?
The fact that the warning thing that you mentioned with like more parameters, if you add, the idea is you will run into something like a moduli space. So you might have so many global minima where you really don't know where you are, basically.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to say it. Now, I won't give any examples of that because they all occur in high codimension, but I'll give you a bit of the reasoning behind how we can classify these things. So one thing to note is that stability really depends on the context of the bifurcation. So I told you about this transcritical bifurcation before. And for something like population growth, it is a good model because you would never have a linear term, right? So here was the equation we had. We had dp dt. We didn't have this constant term. We just had rp minus kp squared. And we would never think to add this constant term because why would there be a constant factor in the growth of the population? Or to say it another way, we expect that p equals 0 is always a fixed point. If there's no population, how is it going to change, right? So that model puts us in a specific class of dynamical systems. If we leave that in which it's a stable bifurcation, if we allow this constant term though, so we're considering a more general class of models, then it's no longer stable. This constant term is an important perturbation. What it does in terms of the bifurcation diagram, so here was the bifurcation diagram. So now I've drawn the parameter in the horizontal direction and the fixed points in the vertical direction here. So you can see we have these, you can kind of think about these two fixed points are coming together and they're just kissing and then coming off. And in fact, if you add this constant term, if I have it with the right sign here, whatever sign this is, they don't even come together at all. They just get near each other and then they scoot off to wherever they were going. For the other sign of that linear term, instead we get two saddle node bifurcations where actually the pairs come together and annihilate, and then for a while there's no fixed points at all, and then there's new fixed points again. So if I draw the phase diagram, it's a particularly nice way to see what's happening here, is that, so if I draw R along this axis and A along this axis, then there's a region where there are 2 fixed points, and there's a region where there are no fixed points. And the boundary between these regions is some curve, which is just going to be a saddle node bifurcation. If I go across this curve in any of these typical directions, then I get a saddle node bifurcation. For example, this family, so this is a 1 parameter, there's 1 parameter drawn here. You can think about that as taking some A around here and tuning R like this. So you start off with 2 fixed points. That's like over here. And then you increase R. Then you have a saddle node bifurcation. So that's this point where they disappear. Then you have no fixed points for a while. That's this region in between. Then you encounter another saddle node bifurcation here, where 2 fixed points are born again, and now we're in this region again. The transcritical, or now let me say this one where there's no bifurcations at all, we're always in the 2 fixed point region. That's just some line up here. The transcritical bifurcation at A equals 0, that's actually a tangent line to this separating curve. And so that's why it's special. Even though in this 2 parameter phase diagram, there's only saddle node bifurcations, if you have some reason to consider a tangent curve to the space of saddle node bifurcations, you get a new kind of bifurcation. So this is kind of a, you could think of other reasons why you would consider a restricted class of functions. For instance, if you had symmetries or something like that. These are the 2 typical reasons, whether you want to say you always have a fixed point, or you want to say you have some symmetry or something like that. So there's a nice geometric way to picture all of the drawings that I've shown you, which is that if we think about the space formed by our state variables and our parameters, so here we're just thinking about 1D, so just 1x, but perhaps many parameters, p. But you can think about this in an any-dimensional system, really. The fixed points are going to be solutions of this equation, dx dt equals 0, right? Which is some function of x and p. So this describes a hypersurface inside this space of x and p. So for instance, in the saddle node bifurcation, where the model was dx dt equals x squared minus p, the fixed points are solutions to this equation, x squared minus p equals 0, which we can think about as, these points are the solutions to that equation in the xp plane. Right, it's this parabola. Now, what I want to do is consider a mathematical projection. It's a linear projection where we just forget x, right? So we just take, for any pair xp that solves this equation, we just take the p. So what that's doing in this picture is we're flattening the map. It's a projection onto the x-axis. And so if you think about that as a map from the fixed point set, that's this parabola is just getting smooshed onto the p-axis. And bifurcations, now here's the key observation, is that the special thing about the saddle node bifurcation here is that that's where this curve is changing direction relative to the vertical line. So that's going to be a singularity of the map from this curve to the x-axis. Singularity in the sense that if you just think about this a map from, this map is basically the square root map. And at, well, do I want to say that? No, this map is x squared, and shouldn't call it x. Anyway, the singularity just says that we have a vanishing derivative here, right? If we do a little variation along the curve here, it results in no variation in the image because we're at a tangent point. And in fact, all of the bifurcation sets of fixed points can be understood in this kind of way. So for instance, in this pitchfork bifurcation that I told you about, so that was a system that had 2 parameters. So if we plot the parameters here, I took this from a book, so I didn't get to name the variables. So if the parameters are the 2 horizontal coordinates here, and the state variable x is the third, this surface describes the fixed points. And the projection of this surface onto the 2 parameter space, it has a singularity exactly along this cusp curve, where these parts of the singularities locally look like this projection. It's called a fold because the surface is folding on itself and you have a crease. And then here where you have you have a fold from one side and a fold from the other side, and they meet together here, that's where we have the cuspidal point. And you can use this singularity picture quite generally to think about what can these sorts of bifurcation diagrams look like, and what are their bifurcation points. The next one exists with 3 parameters. And so I can't draw you the 3 manifold embedded in the 3 parameters plus 1 state variable space, but I can draw you the phase diagram in the 3 parameter space. And it looks like this. You have some surfaces separating regions where you have different behavior. You have a region with no fixed points, a region with 2 fixed points, a region with 4 fixed points, and then you have all of these interesting, maybe this should be, no, I think that's right. And then you have these separations between them where the surfaces are saddle node bifurcations. They occur in codimension 1, right? You can tune through them with just 1 parameter. The curves here are cusps. You can kind of see in the cross section here that it's a cusp. And there's one very special point in this diagram, which is the new point that we haven't seen before, which is called a swallowtail bifurcation. And I'm going to give you some simulator to play around with swallowtail bifurcation. But anyway, the point stands that if you want to study these bifurcation diagrams, we basically need to study the fixed point equation, think about projecting onto the parameter space, and look at the singularities of that map. And the nice thing about that is that the singularities of maps have been studied extensively. And there's kind of a general theory where if you have a map from a space with m dimensions to a space with n dimensions, there are certain kind of behaviors that you expect. In particular, if you're thinking about just real valued functions, so that's a map from a space with m dimensions to a space with just 1 dimension, right, which is just the value of your function, then things are very nicely behaved. You have Morse theory. So all critical points are basically easy to classify. On the other hand, if you're taking a map from a space into a very high dimensional space, so if n is very much bigger than m, then we're over here somewhere, now we're thinking about embeddings. And embeddings won't have singularities at all. Generically speaking, there's no reason for an embedding to have any singularities. But in between, there's kind of this like there be dragons region. And actually for dynamical systems, we're interested in exactly the worst case, which is the number of dimensions of the source space, right, which is the fixed point set. So here it's a 2-dimensional surface. And the number of dimensions of the parameter space, so here it's another 2 dimensions, are always the same, right? So here's 1-dimensional fixed point set, 1-dimensional parameter space. So we're kind of in this, on this, devil's diagonal. So all hell is going to break loose around 9 parameters, but maybe that's fine. Maybe we don't want to study things with that many parameters. And in fact, if we don't care about things with that many parameters, the complexity doesn't even depend on the dimensionality of the system that much. Actually, if there's a small number of parameters, it's the same bifurcations you see over and over again, no matter how many x variables you have. So kind of P is the culprit of everything. And if we just have 1 dimension of x, then we have just these simple polynomial bifurcations, which are the generalizations of the ones that I talked about. And then there's this nice list. There's actually infinitely many things in this list, but they have more and more codimension, but all of the ones of small codimension, you can just write down. Here's the codimension 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4. So this is a very useful set of data. And this was also one of the things that got people very, very excited about catastrophe theory, because you could sort of understand, not only could you understand discontinuous phenomena, but you sort of had a classification of them.
So
But,
Ryan,
yeah.
This will be valid for any codimension, or any codimension bifurcations with X being in one dimension. Once we go to X being 2 dimensions or 3, you will have the problem that you might not be able to project that into the singularity map, right?
Yeah, I'm getting to this point. So yeah, why didn't we classify everything just now? There's a good reason for that, which we're probably going to talk about a lot, which is that, here we just studied fixed points, and in 1 dimensions, that's really all there is. But in higher dimensions, or even discrete systems, we have limit cycles, we have strange attractors. This whole argument goes out the window, because we're no longer even thinking, our bifurcation sets don't even look like manifolds anymore. There's no way to do this kind of thinking. So this all works really well for fixed points, but for non-fixed points, the world of bifurcations is very much very wild. So here is a famous graph that I'll just say 2 minutes talking about. So this is a discrete system where you basically take this, you choose some A is a parameter, and you iterate this map over and over again, right? So you just take this function and you keep plugging it into itself. And for A in some range, so here's from A from 1 to 3, for any X between 0 and 1, if you apply this function enough, that function is going to approach an attractive fixed point. So for any value of A, what's drawn here is the fixed point corresponding to that value of A. And as you tune A, this fixed point, okay, it's moving, it's hanging out, it's hanging out. Here, it just disappears. If we were just plotting fixed points, this diagram would end right here. Because what actually happens in this system is that suddenly we have a periodic orbit. So this is a new kind of bifurcation. This is one where a fixed point turns into a period 2 orbit. So if you have a value here, you apply the function. Now it's here, you apply it, you're back. So the function is just going back and forth. And then we have more complicated bifurcations. That's called a period doubling bifurcation. Then we have further period doubling bifurcations, and we have a whole mess of them, right? And eventually we have chaos. I'm sure we'll talk about that. So you can draw this diagram quite easily by just taking all of the initial conditions. Let's see if I can load this up. Oh, you can't see it anymore. You'll have to. Okay, where did you go?
We'll probably have like a separate session on just the discrete logistic map.
Yeah. So you'll have my slides, so you can fire this up and see that you can generate these diagrams very easily by just plugging in initial conditions and just letting the system run. And you can find all the attractors by seeing where they end up. You won't see the unstable fixed points though. So it's slightly different from the bifurcation diagrams we were drawing, not only because we're drawing more complicated attractors, but also because the repellers don't show up. So what's not illustrated here is that there's actually an unstable fixed point.
We'll talk about intermittency, all that stuff later, maybe.
Yeah. So that's just to make the point that, fixed points are not the end, but we understand fixed points very well. Okay, that's all. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That was awesome.
I'm glad.
Also a taster for lots of fairly advanced topics. So if anyone feels that was a little over the heads, even I feel a lot of these topics are, quite advanced. So it would be nice to return to them after we go into two-dimensional systems a little bit, but as we kind of touched on, some of them we can't really talk about with higher dimensions. But any
So
more?
I have a
Just ask questions. I'll show you that thing that I said, which is like the same population model, but just interpreted as a neural model. I can just show you
Nice.
that in just a second.
So a suggestion for people who are like new to bifurcation stuff, I would say like just sit and like take the normal form that you have in Strogat's book and keep drawing the bifurcation diagram with stable versus unstable, like on and on and on and on again and again. And it's like that's the only way you can do it. Or you can do like what Ryan did with a simple example for every normal form of that bifurcation thing and come up with your curve to have a better understanding. But it takes some time to get that, like as you vary the parameter, how that not only do you see like a simple bifurcation, but it kind of like has these bizarre behaviors depending on how you look at it. And once you go into 2D and like with hop bifurcation and all that stuff, it gets even crazier. So it's sort of something that is good for people in general to practice. Like even with the simple examples given in Strogat's, I think it'll be useful. Yeah.
And if you do have any coding experience, these are very short programs to write, and I highly recommend coding them up. And because generating it yourself really helps you get a feel for what's happening. In fact, I just did that for this, what I'm about to show you. And the other thing is that like I know last time we talked a lot about examples and with Kale, and I sympathize with anyone who finds this all a little too abstract and not grounded in specific scientific examples. But one way to think about what we've done so far is that we're trying to just understand the notation in some sense, because many of the good examples that are relevant to biology are in 2 dimensions. So we haven't even really gotten there yet. But we need to first have some feeling for looking at something in terms of its derivatives and thinking about where it tends to go. That feeling of tending is what you want to get at this point. The intuition of pushing and pulling and tending. And if you work with the bifurcations, you'll also get this picture of the collisions, annihilation, things like that. So there's certain very general phenomena that don't depend on the specifics of the equation's form, where you can see attractors, fixed points annihilating each other and things like that. And that, in some sense, can take you far in understanding even things like particle physics and stuff like that. There's a sense in which you can go there with that insight. So it's very abstract. So don't feel like you need to apply this to neuroscience anytime soon. But let me just talk about this neural amplifier, but questions also. If no questions, then I'm going to just show this. We already looked at, Ryan showed us a transcritical bifurcation, and in the population diagram. And I like Strogatz's way of introducing that. We have some information such as the idea that X can't go below zero, definitely has a fixed point at 0. And that kind of gives us a reason for restricting the functional form. And but I was just thinking, well, for us in the CNS department, one sec, we often looked at this equation as our model of a single neuron's firing rate, where X is the firing rate. So it's a major abstraction. And let's say that this is a kind of normalized firing rate, meaning that 1 is the in principle maximum firing rate that it can have. And we have an excitation term, there's no inhibition, and there's a decay term. So when you have excitation, it will tend to go up until it reaches some maximum. And if you take the excitation away, it decays back down exponentially, basically to 0. Very easy to solve this if you have the math for that. And now what happens if the output of a neuron. I've just drawn a badly drawn pyramidal neuron there. And my parameter here is going to be the connection weight. This, I don't even know. I work in an anatomy lab and we can't really say that this ever happens. So you have to take this with a large pinch of salt. I think it probably happens once in a while, just, by fluke, but it's not clear that it's an important aspect of neural firing. But if you reinterpret a single pyramidal neuron as a group of neurons, which we can talk about in depth in a moment, then something like this almost definitely happens. So basically now this is positive or destabilizing feedback. I had discussion with Kale about the term positive and negative confuses some people. And I was saying, well, the other terms don't help. But Strogatz's term, stabilizing and destabilizing feedback, I think is a pretty good pair of terms. So destabilizing feedback in this case is not necessarily a bad thing. So now I've just rederived the same equation that we just saw in terms of the way that I've framed it, in terms of a connection weight and a decay rate. So there's two fixed points. The boring one is x is equal to 0. The other one, w minus d over w, it's only positive when w is greater than d. Or if you want, since that is equivalent to 1 minus d over w, you can, so basically when w exceeds d, is the only time that's going to be positive. It's an unrealistic model in the sense that there aren't pyramidal neurons that have no input other than themselves, but we can still look at what the stability of a system like this might be. Let's say that there's like a transient input. So I just simulated this, and what I did was we haven't talked that much about this, but in one dimensions you can always derive a potential for which gives you the concrete metaphor of moving down a valley. So think of this V as valley, although it originally comes from voltage. But so in one dimensions, you just integrate that with respect to x, the derivative, x dot, and you get a potential, which you can use as your guide for where the system tends to go. And I've just drawn the potential on the left for different values of w. So I haven't done a full, bifurcation diagram, but I've spanned the bifurcation, which we just saw anyway. I just wanted to show you what a perturbation is, because sometimes it's not always clear what that means. But so right now w is less than d, which means that we have only one fixed point, 0. What that means is, now here at the middle of this, I've just extrinsically bumped x up, meaning that something happened, some neurotransmitter just happened to release, let's say, quantum release of vesicle release has taken place, and you get some small bump in firing, then it goes back to 0. I have one more perturbation after that. I have now put this at where it's again 0, and this is where the bifurcation actually happens, where d over w is equal to 1. At that situation, the shape of this potential well, it's only half because we're only interested in positive values of x. So the shape is more or less the same, but you'll see that the bottom of it is very flat, much flatter than just in the other one. And this is reflected in the fact that the exact same perturbation takes way longer to reach 0. In fact, by the time I reach the second bump, it still hasn't reached 0. But again, it's very, very slowly going back down to 0. So
is X
yes.
here, say, a neurotransmitter concentration? What is X representing? What could it
represents firing rate?
X is firing rate.
Firing rate.
Is changing activity of firing rate.
But we can interpret it in other ways. And I think it's helpful to actually think of it in multiple levels simultaneously. But I'll just walk through the second part. So now we've come to where there is an actual positive fixed point. I've pushed W up, so the self-excitation strength is quite a bit stronger now, the synaptic weight. And now we have something that looks like an attractor valley. And what that means is, so I've placed it exactly on that unstable. So now that earlier 0, which was a stable attractor, is now an unstable It's a repeller. So it's sitting there just because I've placed it initially exactly on there. But now when I perturb it, it moves to the new stable fixed point. And if I bump it, I could have bumped it down or up. It would have returned, and this dotted line just marks where that new fixed point has shown up. So now, like I said, it's not clear the parameter neurons do anything like this. And in any case, they always have external input. So, but you can think of groups of cells now. Now replace the idea of X as firing rate, and imagine that I have a population of excitatory neurons that have all-to-all kind of connectivity, maybe random matrix. And what I'm interested in now, X represents not the firing rate of any one neuron, but the percentage of cells that are firing. So now I have the same idea, but instead I'm thinking about a population. And I will have a system that, now imagine that my control parameter is maybe some external influence on the entire network. For instance, a cortical connection that makes DLPFC primed to amplify whatever it receives, or a neurotransmitter that over and above the existing synaptic weight sort of primes the system. So what is this now? We have a network that's a little bit like a tripwire, in the sense that it might be at a stable 0, which is what you want when nothing interesting is happening. But let's say you want to be extremely sensitive to something in the environment. You may use what in the brain is it's a parameter, but it's also a dynamical component. But let's say the acetylcholine level has been raised as a result of attention, and now that network is poised to pick up on a small perturbation. Now it retains that, so it doesn't just go back to 0 when the say that a brief sound has gone. It holds it. In this case, it holds it forever. But presumably there'll be other ways of bringing the system back down when maybe say the acetylcholine level goes back down. So now you can also think of this as a model of social networks and things going viral in social networks. So is that clear? And does that help?
So, Johan, that was a really beautiful description of that. I mean, another way to think about what could damp it down is the sort of many and varied circuits in the brain that inhibit or disinhibit one another, such that they kind of push towards inhibition. So I'm thinking of somewhere like in the thalamus, where you've got the reticular nucleus kind of acting like a shell around the excitatory core of the thalamus. And each of the times that the thalamic nuclei leave the thalamus, they sort of synapse with part of the reticular nucleus and activate it. And so what they're essentially going to be doing is driving that W value back down, right? So that overall the system doesn't like high W values. And every now and again, a W value can get high in an individual group of neurons, but overall the system's like, no, don't want that, and it'll end up quashing it back down over time. And I think that one of the sort of really interesting places that I hope that we can get to in this discussion is working out how we could put some of the language of the mathematics that we're describing here into those kinds of circuits that we know exist in nervous systems and are really crucial for the nervous systems to function. And that's just one example, but there's many. The cortex has its own particular set of characteristic connectivity patterns, the way the cortex interacts with the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge number of opportunities for, I think, people with physics leaning to come in and start to ask questions about how the neuroscience could be shaped in this dynamical systems language that I'm really excited to see. And this is just an example of how you can kind of push in that direction.
Some of my models are that very system. In fact, one of the papers
cool.
I worked on with the corticothalamic loop had a paragraph talking about attractors, and
oh, great.
And I had to remove it because of the
no.
But
it's funny, right? It's a gnarly concept for people. It's not something, I ever came across until way after undergraduate, after medical school. It was really kind of deep into my postdoc when I first came across the term attractor and came across dynamical systems. And it's obviously, really, really common in physics and complex systems and parts of engineering. And I think I'd been exposed to it in areas like chemistry, for example, where you've got a set of chemicals that are interacting with one another, but can't overcome an activation energy hump. And they require a catalyst to lower the activation energy so that they can interact together and to form another set of products or reactants or whatever. I can't remember the terms now. But so the ideas were there, but the actual language and the mathematics weren't something that I was ever really exposed to. So I think part of the challenge is like pitching this in such a way that neuroscientists don't immediately just, vomit in their mouth a little bit and run the other direction, so that they go, oh, cool, I get why you're showing me this. Because it actually really is such a rich language, and it clearly matches the kind of system we're trying to describe, I think.
We should talk more, because this is worthy of a review, of a simple sort of review paper or even a tutorial. But for instance,
agreed.
Things like working memory and any sort of memory, but working memory is already well modeled by some of these things. Like Xiaojing Wang has been.
I was going to say, and John Murray, yeah.
Bump attractor. Himanshu, would you like to tell people a little bit about the ring attractor because that's one-dimensional so you might be able to give people a glimpse into a spatial navigation attractor that I think people will be interested in.
You're muted, Himanshu.
So Himanshu's work was on a grid cell model, and he used a really nice attractor called a ring attractor, which he will now explain.
Yeah, it's the idea is like relatively simple. It's the idea is that your space is instead of a straight line like we have seen in the examples here, is basically a circle. So at any given point of time, your stable point, wherever that is going to be a point on a circle. Now, what does this mean in terms of actual experimental observations or whatever, right? It means that the values that your system can take are not infinite values. They are values that come from a finite set of some sort. So they can either be finite sets in the sense that there are like 10 values that your system can basically always stabilize to, or they can be something like, in the case of spatial navigation, one of the cells that people have found in various parts of in various regions in the brain are called head direction cells. So they're localized to a specific direction that the animal is looking at, and as the animal moves their head, these the firings of these head directions will change. So if I have a head direction cell, if in an animal a specific head direction cell is localized to say looking north. Now it's not really north in terms of magnetic sense. It's a line based on cues in the environment. But let's just for the sake of convention say that it's looking north, and a given head direction cell is active. As the animal turns its head, its activity will reduce to like 0 or whatever, and then some other cell will take over the activity or resume will have its activity rise. And as you basically have the animal turning a full circle, you'll see the activities basically shift between one cell to another cell to another cell, eventually returning back to the first cell that you started with when 360 rotation is completed, right? And this is the essence of what a ring attractor is that your stable point can move around as you change your parameters, and eventually it loops back. So it's a closed space in that respect. Don't know if that was too confusing or.
I think maybe next time we could draw a diagram of it and why you might want something like that. But I think broadly, an intuition to keep in mind is that, here's a slightly polemical way of saying it, there's a tendency to describe what the brain does as coding or representation. And I don't dispute that sometimes that is the right thing to say. However, problem with the coding metaphor is that it ends up making everything seem like transfer functions, where irrespective of what the history of the system is, my face detection cell or whatever is always going to say, oh, it's Jennifer Aniston. And maybe there are parts of the brain that work that way. But in general, if you ask actual electrophysiologists what their neurons look like, they don't look anything like that. They are always history dependent in ways that we still don't have a good, kind of grasp on. Like Karthik can tell you more about that. He records from monkeys. But to take time seriously as a dimension, it's starting to happen a lot. Some of what Mark Churchland is doing, I appreciate. Karthik can criticize that later. But some of this stuff is starting to take the idea that what the system is doing depends on what it and its neighbors have been doing in the recent past, or even in the fairly long past. So there you have a situation where it might not even be a stable attractor, but it may be something that is like a quasi attractor, but reflects this hysteresis. So and the reason I like the word hysteresis instead of memory is that memory comes with a lot of psychological baggage and also computer science baggage, which we don't necessarily need when we want to talk about certain forms of remembered behavior. Like, no doubt, when humans are engaged in episodic memory, we do need all that. Or when I'm remembering the formula for, Pythagoras theorem or something like that. But I think a lot of remembered behavior, particularly in rodents and some of the monkey experiments, may be better described using a hysteresis framework. And it can be hysteresis in a slow working memory kind of timescale, or trained behavior where we have a hysteresis at the level of synaptic weights which arise because of reinforcement learning. So the whole family of explanation or examples that we'll get to, and once we cover cyclic behavior in 2D, it'll be a lot easier to talk about a lot of them. So it's any questions? It's 10:30, so it's just anything anyone would like to bring up. I think I haven't looked at the next chapter, but I'd like to get to chapter 5 quickly. So I will read chapter 4 and then maybe give you updates, but maybe everyone can look at chapter 5.
People want to do chapter 4 because it's all the flows on a circle. So it's kind of like all the, people are interested in kind of like the theories about harmonic and non-harmonic oscillators.
You think we should spend one session on chapter 4?
I'm just saying, no, I'm asking whether people want to do it. I would like to skip it now.
I want to get to chapter 5. So I will read chapter 4 and give highlights.
I will skip it, but we can always go back to it because because even from the neuroscience perspective, there's an important aspect for chapter 4, which is that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The people who are interested in all these oscillations theory, there is a very important thing that they usually miss when they actually talk about oscillations, because it's the flow in a circle. Once you have nonlinearity, is no longer your harmonic oscillators. They behave differently, and their oscillations are not the way we frame theories when we talk about alpha, beta, gamma, blah, 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 all that, EEG, MEG ideas, because if your system is purely harmonic as an oscillator, then it is what we would term as structurally extremely unstable. Not something that you would desire in any real world system.
So Karthik, why don't you, I mean, I'll read it too, but you go through chapter 4 and give us a little, whatever you'd like to talk about from chapter 4 next week.
Okay.
Even if it's just 10 minutes, but we'll mainly cover chapter 5 and get to, and that's where we'll have, we'll get to see oscillations. And then the plan is, I think then maybe the following week, we can talk about spiking models. That I think is a near-term plan. Any questions, comments, requests?
I have a question for the. Oh, you can. Okay, I have a question for the neuroscientists. I saw an interesting talk this morning from Evelyn Tang at the Max Planck Institute. I don't know if have any of you heard
What
of
was
this
the last
person?
name?
Tang.
Oh, I know her.
Oh, you know her. That's
Yeah.
cool. It was a really interesting talk. It was about these like thinking about. So she was thinking about like how do you make a clock, a chemical clock, and the idea is that you can draw like a sort of graph of chemical transformations that this molecule can undergo. You know, it can undergo like this many phosphorylations, this many like whatever. You draw all of those combinations as like a grid, and then think about there as being like a stochastic dynamical system as it hops around the grid. And then the idea was that like basically things that we study in condensed matter physics, where you have certain protected, you know, what would tend to happen is that in some of these interesting arrangements of the network, that the activation, you know, the population, if you think about the population of all these molecules, eventually goes to the boundary of this network and then starts going around the boundary at a constant speed. And then this period is now suddenly a large period that you've made out of a small molecule. And that's like a proposal for clocks. And I wondered, like, I guess if you know about that work, if you think it's reasonable, I don't know. It was very much like it was a pitch to us mathematicians who were in the audience of like, here is this cool application we have, but I wonder if it's like a real application.
Did she link it with the circadian rhythm? Like how slow are we talking about?
So she mentioned circadian rhythms. I don't know if that was the only like time scale she had in mind.
So the issue with like any clock system with respect to the brain is that there are multiple clocks operating simultaneously, depending on what you mean by even synchronizing one way or the other. So it's sort of like they all have this baseline circadian rhythm, and then on top of that you have the whole HPA axis, whatnot, and then like individual systems depending on goal-directed behaviors having their own synchrony. So it's sort of like very difficult to come up with a single framework for clock-like behavior. And so that's one thing. And then the other idea is sort of like, we don't know whether there is a single clockmaker that can synchronize multiple areas in the brain, or they kind of like self-synchronize. We don't have any good theory or empirical evidence to suggest that either. So it's sort of a mixed bag.
What we have is a really interesting mixed bag. Like for instance, the famous hippocampal theta, 4 to 7 hertz, sometimes 10 hertz, depending on the species. You have a driver of theta from the medial septum, is one part of the brain. But if you disconnect that part of the brain from the hippocampus, you still get theta. So there's an intrinsic ability of the hippocampus to produce that rhythm, but there's also entrainment. And there may be some situation one thing has adapted to the other, but the chemicals themselves are not in such large concentrations that they can necessarily operate in that limit of those kinds of, cycles. So you would have to make an analogy. Well, you maybe could have some.
Well, apparently you only need one for this kind of model. Pardon? Like one molecule will do this.
Okay. So
which was really cool, which was the idea that like, yeah, normally it's true. Like if you want to get emergent behavior, you need to take a lot of stuff. But here, what was big was the reaction network. It wasn't actually the system. So nice. I thought that was like an insight.
So the idea being that it could be like a clock for the neuron, like for a single cell.
Potentially, yeah.
That's super cool. I would have to look into that. Because one thing I'm interested in is... I
knew which paper she was talking about, but I can find
it. It's like variable recruitment of neurons, or neurons that seem to have the same receptive field and then divert for some reason. And these types of internal mechanisms that are quite slow are very helpful for that sort of thing. So I would like to look at that.
Generally speaking, though, cellular neurophysiologists tend to think a lot more about concentrations of chemicals as a continuous phenomenon rather than state changes of individual molecules.
Right.
Yeah, I think if you have like a concentration, you'll basically see the average behavior of, what is for one molecule a very, random process, but with this like average
Yes.
cycling.
And you can construct clocks by having, two different chemical species that are coupled to each other so that you get sine waves that are 90 degrees out of phase, just, like in electromagnetic type clocks.
That's interesting. I'd like to have a look at it.
Huh.
Any other?
Somebody said they know her.
I thought
Charles?
she was at MIT, right? She was at MIT and then she moved somewhere.
Okay,
No, I
she's at
actually met
MPI
her
now.
in Berkeley.
Oh yeah, she was at Berkeley, the Simons Institute.
Yeah, she was
Yeah.
there for a semester.
Yeah.
Oh, were you at Berkeley too? I was a Berkeley guy.
Well, I was there for just a semester at a program.
Simons Institute or
The Science
Redwood Center.
Institute, Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
That was a great place. Yeah.
Yeah, were you there?
Well, I was a grad student at Berkeley, so I often went to the Simons Center and also the Redwood Center. It's like the computational neuroscience thing.
Yeah, they had a program on the brain computation. I think it was in spring of 2018, I think, or 2019. And
yeah, I think I had just left, but that one looked really cool.
yeah, it was nice.
I think I'll end the recording, and if anyone wants final comments, off the record comments.